Hello. Hello, everyone. I All right. Here we go. This is going to be my third time trying this uninterrupted. And if it happens again, I'm just going to roll with it and see what happens. So, Ishmael, I don't know. Like I keep getting these like restriction notifications popping up on my live, like it's age restricted or I need to disclose that I'm getting paid for something and I'm not getting, this is not a paid thing. I'm not getting paid for this. I'm just reading a book. And it's not age restricted. It's no more age restricted than the other times I've been reading. So honestly, I don't know what happened. Your guess is as good as mine. And I'm trying to figure out if I said something that triggered something in the video. I don't know, and I'm trying to like block stuff. I really don't know, but I'm gonna see what happens. I'm gonna start reading and see what's going on. So wish me luck. And if for anyone who sees this on my YouTube later, we're starting at chapter 16. I'm just gonna skip all of the normal intro stuff because I've tried 3 times right now. I don't know if I need mods. I don't know, because again, I'm not doing anything different than I did last week or the weeks prior for months now. I don't know, but I don't know, Ishmael. Maybe I need to look into that, but I'm just gonna start reading, and you guys wish me luck. We'll see how this goes. Okay. Chapter 16. So far, so good. Evening came. Kira, in Thomas's room, looked down through the window at the squalor of the village and listened to its chaotic din as workers in the various sheds finished their last chores. Down the lane she could see how the butcher threw a container of water over the stone doorstep of his hut, a useless gesture toward cleaning away the clotted filth. Nearer, she watched the women leaving the weaving shed, where she had worked as helper for so much of her childhood. Kira wondered, smiling, whether Matt had been there during the workday that had just ended. Assigned to cleaning up chores, he had probably been underfoot with his mates, making trouble and stealing food from the women's lunches. From her place at the window, she couldn't see any sign of him or of his dog. She hadn't seen them all day. She waited there with Thomas until long past dark, until the tenders had taken their food trays away. At last, the entire building was still, and the clamor from the village had subsided as well. "Thomas," Kira suggested, "take your little piece of wood, the special one. I have my scrap with me." "All right, but why?" "I don't know exactly. I feel that we should." Thomas got the small carved piece from its high shelf and put it into his pocket. In his other pocket was the wooden key. Together they went down the dimly lit corridor to the stairs. Ahead of her, Thomas whispered, "Shh." "I'm sorry," Kira whispered back. "The stick makes a noise, but I can't walk without it." "Here, wait." They stopped beside one of the wall torches. Thomas ripped a length of cloth from the hem of his loose shirt. Deftly he tied it around the base of Kira's walking stick. The cloth muted the noise of the wooden stick on the tiled floor. The pair made their way quickly down the flight of stairs and to the door of the room where Joe slept. They paused there and listened, but there were no sounds. Kira's hand in her pocket felt no warning from her scrap of cloth. She nodded to Thomas, and silently he inserted the big key and turned it to open the door. Kira held her breath because she feared that a tender might be sharing the room to guard the tyke at night, But the room, illuminated only by pale moonlight through the window, held only one small bed and one small, fast-asleep girl. "I'll stay by the door to watch," Thomas murmured. "She knows you, or your voice at least. You wake her." Kira went to the bed and sat on its edge, propping her stick beside her. Gently she touched the small shoulder. "Joe," she said softly. The little head, long hair tangled, turned restlessly. After a moment, the tyke opened her eyes with a startled, frightened look. "No, don't!" she cried, pushing Kira's hand away. "Shh," Kira whispered. "It's me. Remember? We talked through the door. Don't be afraid." "I want me mum," the tyke wailed. She was very small, much smaller than Matt, hardly more than a toddler. Kira remembered the power of the singing voice that she had heard, and marveled that it had come from this tiny, frightened waif of a thing. Kira picked her up, cradled her, and rocked her back and forth. "Shh," she said. "Shh, it's all right. I'm your friend. And see over there? His name is Thomas. He's your friend too." Gradually the tyke was soothed. Her eyes opened wide. Her thumb slid into her mouth, and she spoke around it. "I be listening to you at the hole," she said, remembering. "Yes, the keyhole. We whispered to each other." "You know me mum? Can you bring her?" Kira shook her head. "No, I'm afraid I can't. But I'll be here. I live just upstairs. And Thomas does too." Thomas came nearer and knelt by the bed. The tyke stared at him suspiciously and clutched Kira. Thomas pointed to the ceiling. "I live right above you," he said in a gentle voice, "and I can hear you." "You hear me singings?" He smiled. "Yes, your singing is very beautiful." The tyke scowled. "They always be making me learn new ones." "New songs?" Kira asked her. Joe nodded unhappily. "Over and over. They be making me remember everythings. Me old songs, they just be there natural. But now they be stuffing new things into me, and this poor head hurts horrid." The tyke rubbed her tangled hair and sighed, a strangely adult sound that made Kira smile sympathetically. Thomas was looking around the room, which held many of the same pieces of furniture as the rooms above. A bed, a tall wooden chest of drawers, a table and 2 chairs. "Joe," he said suddenly, "are you a good climber?" Joe frowned and removed her thumb from her mouth. "I be climbing trees sometimes in the fen, but me mum, she hits me when I do because she say I be breaking me legs, and then they take me to the field." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Yes, that's probably true, and your mother didn't want you to get hurt. Once draggers take you to the field, you don't never come back. Beasts take you." The thumb popped back in. "But look, Joe, if you could climb up there," Thomas pointed to the top of the chest of drawers. The wide eyes followed his pointing finger, and the tyke nodded. "If you stood very tall up there, and if you had some tool, you could hit the ceiling, and I would hear you." The tyke grinned at the thought. "You mustn't do it just for fun," Thomas added quickly, "only if you really needed us." "Might I be trying it?" Joe asked eagerly. Kira lifted her down to the floor. Like a limber animal, the tyke scrambled from the chair to tabletop, and from the tabletop she climbed to the top of the chest. Then she stood triumphantly. From below her woven nightdress emerged 2 bare, thin legs. "We need a tool," Thomas murmured, looking around. Remembering something from her own quarters, Kira went to the bathroom. As she had guessed, a thick hairbrush with a wooden handle lay on the shelf beside the sink. "Try this," she said, and handed it up to the tyke. Smiling broadly, the little singer reached up and thumped the brush handle on the ceiling. Thomas lifted her down and put her back into the bed. "That's it, then," he said. "If you need us, that's the signal, Joe. But never just for fun. Only if you need help." "And we'll come to see you too, even if you don't thump," Kira added, "after the tenders are gone." She tucked the bed covers around the tyke. Here, Thomas, put this back, would you? She handed him the hairbrush. We must go now, she told Joe. But do you feel better, knowing that you have friends up there? The tyke nodded. Her moist thumb slid into her mouth. Kira smoothed the blanket. Good night, then. For a moment she sat there on the bed, feeling a vague memory of something else that should be done. Something from when she was a small tyke, like this, being put to bed. She leaned down toward the little girl, intuitively. What was it that her mother had done when she was small? Kira put her lips on Joe's forehead. It was an unfamiliar gesture, but felt right. The little girl made a small, contented sound with her own lips against Kira's face. A little kissy, she whispered, like me mum. Kira and Thomas parted in the upstairs corridor and made their way separately back to their own rooms. It was late, and as always, they were expected to work in the morning and needed sleep. As Kira prepared for bed, she thought about the frightened, lonely tyke below. What songs were they forcing her to learn? Why was she here at all? Ordinarily, an orphan tyke would be turned over to another family. It was the same question that she and Thomas had discussed the day before, and the answer seemed to be the conclusion they had reached. They were artists, the three of them, makers of song, of wood, of threaded patterns. Because they were artists, they had some value that she could not comprehend. Because of that value, the three of them were here, well-fed, well-housed, and nurtured. She brushed her hair and teeth and got into bed. The window was open to the breeze. Below, she could see the half-completed constructions that would soon be her dying garden, fire pit, and shed. Across the room, through the darkness, she could see the folded, covered shape on top of her work table, the singer's robe. Suddenly, Kira knew that although her door was unlocked, she was not really free. Her life was limited to these things and this work. She was losing the joy she had once felt when the bright-colored threads took shape in her hands, when the patterns came to her and were her own. The robe did not belong to her, though she was learning its story through her work. She would almost be able to tell the history now that it had passed through her fingers, now that she had focused on it so closely for so many days, but it was not what her hands or heart yearned to do. Thomas, uncomplaining though he was, had mentioned the headaches that afflicted him after hours of work. So had the little singer below. They be stuffing new things into me, the tyke had whimpered. She wanted the freedom to sing her own songs, as she always had. Kira did too. She wanted her hands to be free of the robe, so that they could make patterns of their own again. Suddenly she wished that she could leave this place, despite its comforts, and return to the life she had known. She buried her face in the bedclothes, and for the first time cried in despair. We seem to be doing all right so far, guys. Chapter 17. Thomas, I've worked hard all morning, and you have too. Would you take a walk with me? There's something I want you to see. It was midday. They had both eaten lunch. You want to go down and look at what the workmen are doing? I'll go with you. Thomas set aside the carving tool he had just picked up. Kira noticed again with admiration how intricate the work was on the large singer's staff. Thomas had been smoothing the tiny rough spots from the worn, ancient carvings and reshaping the infinitesimally small edges and curves. It was very similar to the work that Kira herself had been assigned, the repair of the singer's robe, and the entire top of the staff was undecorated. It was smooth, uncarved wood, in the same way that the expanse across the shoulders of the robe was untouched cloth. Kira's work was approaching that unadorned expanse. So was Thomas's, she realized. What will you carve there? She asked him, pointing to the undecorated part. I don't know. They said they'd tell me. She watched as he carefully laid the staff across the table. Actually, she told him, if you want to look at what the workmen are doing, I'll go there with you later. But that's not what I had in mind. Will you go with me first where I want? Thomas nodded good-naturedly. Where's that? He asked. The Fen, Kira told him. He looked at her quizzically. That filthy place? Why would you want to go there? I've never been there. I want to see where Joe lived, Thomas. And Matt still does, he reminded her. Yes, Matt too. I wonder where he is, Thomas. Kira was uneasy. I haven't seen him in 2 days. Have you? Thomas shook his head. Maybe he found another source of food, he suggested, laughing. Matt could point out where Joe lived. Maybe I could even bring something back for her. Maybe she had toys. Did they let you bring things when you came here, Thomas? He shook his head. Just my bits of wood. They didn't want me distracted. Kira sighed. She's so small. She should have a toy. Maybe you could carve her a doll, and I could stitch a little dress for it. I could, I guess, Thomas agreed. He handed Kira her walking stick. Let's go, he said. We'll probably find Matt along the way. Or he'll find us. Together the pair made their way out of the edifice, across the plaza and down the crowded lane. At the weaving shed, Kira paused, greeted the women, and asked about Matt. Haven't seen him. And good riddance, too, one of the workers replied. That useless scamp. When are you coming back, Kira? Another asked. We could use your help, and you're old enough to be on the looms now. With your mother gone, you must need the work. But another woman laughed loudly and pointed to Kira's clean new clothes. She don't need us no more. The looms began to click and move again. Kira turned away. Nearby she heard an oddly familiar, oddly frightening sound. A low growl. Quickly she glanced around, half expecting to see a menacing dog or something worse. But the sound had come from a cluster of women near the butcher's. They burst into laughter when they saw her looking. She saw Vendara in their midst. The scarred woman turned her back on Kira, and she heard the low growl again, a human imitation of a beast. Kira lowered her head and limped past them, ignoring the cruel laughter. Thomas had gone ahead. She could see him far beyond the butcher's. He had stopped near a group of young boys playing in the mud. Dunno, one was saying as she approached. Gimme coins and maybe I could find him. I asked them about Matt, Thomas explained, but they say they haven't seen him. Do you suppose he might be sick? Kira asked, worried. His nose is always running. Maybe we should never have cleaned him up. He was accustomed to that layer of dirt. The boys, slapping their bare feet in the mud, were listening. Matt's the strongest of the strong, one said. He'd never be sick. A smaller one wiped his own runny nose on the back of his hand. His mum be yelling at him. I heard her. And she throwed a rock at him, too. And he laughed at it and run off. When? Kira asked the runny-nosed boy. Dunno, he said. Maybe 2 days ago. It were, chimed in another. 2 days ago. I seed it, too. His mum chucked a rock at him 'cause he tooken some food. He said he were going on a journey. He's all right, Kira, Thomas reassured her, and they walked on. He takes care of himself better than most adults. Here, I think this is where we turn. She followed him down an unfamiliar narrow lane. The huts were closer together here, and close to the edge of the woods, so that they were shaded by trees and smelled of dankness and rot. They came to a foul-smelling stream and crossed it by a slippery, primitive bridge of logs. Thomas took her hand and helped her. It was treacherous with her bad leg, and she feared slipping into the water, which was quite shallow but clogged with filth. On the other side of the stream, beyond the thick, poisonous oleander bushes that were such a danger to tykes, lay the area known as the Fen. In some ways it was similar to the place that Kira had called home. The small cots close together, the incessant wailing of infants, the stench of smoky fires, rotting wood, and unwashed humans. But it was darker here, with the trees thick overhead, and festering with dampness and an odor of ill health. Why must there be such a horrible place? Kira whispered to Thomas. Why do people have to live like this? It's how it is, he replied, frowning. It's always been. A sudden vision slid into Kira's mind. The robe. The robe told how it had always been. And what Thomas had said was not true. There had been times, Oh, such long ago times when people's lives had been golden and green. Why could there not be such times again? She began to say it to him. Thomas, she suggested, you and we're the ones who fill in the blank places. Maybe we can make it different. But she saw how he was looking at her. His look was skeptical, amused. What are you talking about? He didn't understand. Perhaps he never would. Nothing, Kira told him, shaking her head. As they walked, an ominous quiet fell. Kira became aware of eyes. Women stood in shadowed doorways, watching them suspiciously. Kira limped along, trying to find some ways around the garbage-strewn puddles in the path, and felt the hostile stares. It made no sense, she knew, to walk without a destination through this unfamiliar, malevolent place. Thomas, she murmured, we must ask someone. He stopped, and she stopped beside him. They stood uncertainly in the path. What be your purpose? A hoarse voice called from an open window. Kira looked and saw a green lizard slither into the vines at the sill. Behind the fluttering wet leaves, a gaunt-faced woman was holding a tyke in her arms and looking out. There seemed no men around. She realized the men, mostly draggers and diggers, would all be working, and she felt relieved, remembering how they had grabbed at her the day of the weapons. Kira made her way through the thorny underbrush and went closer to the window. Through it, she could see the dark interior of the cot, where several other tykes, half-naked, stood staring dull-eyed and frightened toward her. I'm looking for the boy called Matt, she said politely to the woman. Do you know where he lives? What you be giving me for it? Giving you? I'm sorry, Kira told her, startled by the question. I don't have anything to give. Nary food? No, I'm sorry. Kira held her hands out, showing that they were empty. I have an apple. Thomas approached and, to Kira's surprise, took a dark red apple from his pocket. I saved it from lunch, he explained to Kira in a low voice, and he held it toward the woman. Her thin arm reached out from the open window and grabbed the fruit. She bit at it and began to turn away. Wait, Kira said, the cot where Matt lives. Can you tell us, please? The woman turned back, her mouth full. Further down, she said, chewing noisily. The infant in her arms grabbed at the bitten apple, and she shoved its hands away. She gestured with her head. There be a busted tree in front. Kira nodded. And please, one more thing, she pleaded. What can you tell us about a tyke named Joe? The woman's face changed, and Kira found it hard to interpret the look. For a moment, a brief flicker of joy had washed across the thin, embittered face. Then hopelessness replaced it. The little singing girl, the woman said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She be tooken. They tooken her away. She turned away abruptly and disappeared into the shadowed interior of the cot. Her children began to cry and to claw at her for food. The gnarled tree was dying, split almost to the ground and rotting. Perhaps it had once borne fruit, but now its limbs were broken, dangling at odd angles, punctuated by occasional wisps of brown leaves. The small cot behind the tree looked damaged and neglected, too. But there were voices inside, a woman speaking roughly and a sharp-tongued child answering her in an angry, spiteful tone. Thomas knocked. The voices became quiet, and finally the door opened slightly. Who you be? The woman asked abruptly. We're friends of Matt's, Thomas told her. Is he inside? Is he all right? Who be it, Mum? The child's voice called. The woman peered at Thomas and Kira silently, not answering. Finally, Thomas called to the child. Is Matt at home? What's he done now? What you be wantin' him for? The woman asked, her eyes glinting with mistrust. He runned off, and tooken food, too, a tyke called to them. His head, thick and tousled unkempt hair, appeared beside the woman. He pushed the door open wider. Kira looked in dismay at the cot's dark interior. A pitcher, overturned on a table, lay in a puddle of some thick liquid through which insects crawled. The tyke at the door picked his nose with one finger, scratched himself with the other hand, and stared at them. His mother coughed wetly and then spat something to the floor. "Do you know where he went?" Kira asked, trying not to show how shocked she felt at the condition of these people. The woman shook her head and coughed again. "Good rid to him," she said. She shoved the tyke to the side and pulled the heavy wooden door closed. After a moment, Kira and Thomas turned away. Behind them, they heard the door open. "Miss, I know where Matt goed," the tyke's voice said. He emerged from the cot despite his mother's scolding voice and came to them. He was clearly Matt's brother. He had the same bright, mischievous eyes. They waited. "What you gimme?" His fingers went into his nose again. Kira sighed. Life in the fen was apparently a series of barters. No wonder Matt had become such a clever manipulator and entrepreneur. She looked helplessly at Thomas. "We don't have anything to give you," she explained to the tyke. He eyed her appraisingly. "What about that there, miss?" he suggested, pointing to Kira's neck. She touched the thong from which hung the polished stone. "No," she told the tyke, and her fingers curled protectively around the stone. "This was my mother's. I can't give it to you." To her surprise, he nodded as if that made sense to him. "That there, then?" He pointed to her hair. Kira remembered that she had tied it back that morning, as she often did, with a simple leather cord of no value. Quickly she pulled it loose and held it out. The tyke grabbed it and thrust it into his pocket. It seemed to be a satisfactory payment. "Our mum, she thrashed Matt so hard he was horrid bloody, and so him and Branchy, they goed on a journey and they not be back. Not to the fen," the tyke announced. "Matt, he got friends who be taking good care of him, not thrashing him never, and they give him food too." Thomas laughed a little. "And they make him take baths," he added, though the tyke just stared, not understanding the word. "But he meant us," Kira pointed out. "We're the friends he meant." She was concerned. "If he tried to come to us, where is he? It was 2 days ago that he left here, and no one's seen him since. He knew the way to—" Matt's brother interrupted her. "Him and Branchy. They goed someplace else first. He be getting a gifty for his friends. That be you, miss? And you?" He looked at Thomas. They nodded. "Matt, he say that a gifty makes a person like you best of all." Kira sighed in exasperation. "No, that's not the way it is. A gift—" She gave up. "Never mind. Tell us where he went." "He be getting you some blue." "Blue? What do you mean?" "Dunno, miss. But Matt, he said it. He be saying they got blue yonder, and he be getting you some." The woman reappeared in the open doorway and called in a shrill and angry voice to the tyke, who retreated inside. Thomas and Kira turned away and began to retrace their steps on the muddy path back toward the village. Silent watchers still lurked in doorways. The fetid air still hung humid. Kira whispered to Thomas, "When Matt disappeared, I thought perhaps we would find that he'd been taken too, like Joe." "If he'd been taken," Thomas suggested, "we'd know his whereabouts. He'd be there with us in the council edifice." Kira nodded, "And with Joe, although maybe they'd have locked him up, like her. Oh, he'd hate that." "Matt would find a way to go free," Thomas pointed out. "Anyway," he added, helping Kira find her way around a puddle with a dead rat in it, "they wouldn't want Matt, I'm afraid. They only want us for our skills, and he hasn't any." Kira thought of the impish boy, of his generosity and his laughter, of his devotion to the little dog. She thought of him now, wherever he was, on his quest to bring a gift to friends. "Oh, Thomas," she said, "he does. He knows just how to make us smile and laugh." There seemed no hint of laughter or any history of it in this terrible place. Making her way through the squalor, Kira remembered Matt's infectious chortle. She thought, too, of the clear purity of the small singer's voice, and how the two children must have been the only elements of joy here. Now, Joe had been taken away, and Matt was gone as well. She wondered where he could have journeyed, all alone but for the dog, to search for Blue. Chapter 18. The day of the gathering was approaching. Its nearness was palpable in the village. People began to finish projects and delayed the start of new ones. Kira noticed that in the weaving shed fabrics were folded and stacked, but the looms were not restrung. The noise level subsided as if people were distracted with preparations and didn't want to waste time with the usual bickering. Some people washed. In his room, Thomas was meticulously polishing the singer's staff again and again. He used thick oils and rubbed them into the wood with a soft cloth. Smooth and golden, it began to take on a glow and fragrance. Matt did not return. It had been many days now since he had disappeared. At night, before she slept, Kira held the scrap of cloth that had so often assuaged her fears and even answered her questions. She wrapped it around her fingers and concentrated on Matt. She pictured the laughing boy and sought some feeling of where he might be and whether he was safe. A feeling of reassurance, of solace, came from the scrap, but no answer. They could occasionally hear the voice of the small singer Joe during the day. The crying had ceased. Most often they heard repetitive chanting, the same phrases over and over, though sometimes, as if she were allowed a moment of her own, a high, lyrical voice soared into melodies that made Kira hold her breath in awe. She crept down at night with the key in her hand and visited the tyke. Joe had stopped asking for her mother, but she clung to Kira in the darkness. Together they whispered little stories and jokes. Kira brushed Joe's hair. "I could thump with the hairbrush if I needed," Joe reminded her, looking up at the ceiling. "Yes, and we would come." Kira stroked Joe's soft cheek. "Want I should make a song for you?" Joe asked. "Someday," Kira told her, "but not now. We mustn't make noise in the night. It must be our secret that I come here." "I be thinking up a song," Joe said, "and someday I sing it for you horrid loud." "All right," Kira laughed. "The gathering be soon," Joe said importantly. "Yes, I know." "I be right up front, they say." "Good for you. So you'll be able to see everything. You'll be able to see the beautiful singer's robe. I've been working on it," Kira told her. "It has wonderful colors." "When I be singer," the tyke confided, "then I can make my own songs again. If'n I learn the old ones good." When Jameson came to her room, Kira showed him that the repairs to the robe were complete. He was obviously pleased with her work. Together they spread the fabric across the table, turning it, unfolding its pleating and cuffs, examining the intricate stitches and the scenes they created. "You've done a fine job, Kira," he said, "particularly here." He pointed to a place that she recalled had been difficult for her. Though tiny in size, as each embroidered scene was, it was a complicated portrayal of tall buildings in shades of gray, each of them toppling against a background of fiery explosions. Kira had matched oranges and reds of different shades, and had found the various grays for the smoke and the buildings. But the threading had been hard for her because she had no sense of what the buildings were. She had never seen anything like them. The council edifice in which she lived and worked was the only large building she knew, and it was small compared to these. These, before they toppled, had seemed to extend up into the sky to amazing heights, much, much higher than any tree she had ever seen. That was the hardest part, she told Jameson. It was so complicated. Perhaps if I had known more about the buildings, about what happened to them— She was embarrassed. "I should have paid more attention to the ruins song each year," she confessed. "I was always so excited when it began, but then my mind would wander a bit, and I didn't always listen carefully." "You were young," Jameson reminded her, "and the song is very, very long. No one listens carefully to every part, and especially not the tykes." "This year I will," Kira told him. "This year I'll be paying special attention because I know the scenes so well. I'll be listening especially for this scene, with the buildings falling." Jameson closed his eyes. She could see his lips move silently. He started to hum, and she recognized a recurrent melody from part of the song. Then he began to chant aloud. "Burn, scourged world, Furious furnace, inferno impure. He opened his eyes. I believe that's the part, he said. It goes on and on after that. I forget the next words, but I believe that's the part where the building's toppled. Of course, I've listened to the song for many more years than you. I can't imagine how the singer remembers it all, Kira said. For a moment she thought of asking him about the captive child below, the singer of the future, who was being forced to learn the interminable song, but she hesitated, and the moment passed. Of course he has the staff as a guide, Jameson said, and he began learning when he was just a small tyke. That was a very long time ago, and he rehearses constantly. While you've been preparing his robe, he's been preparing this year's song. The words are always the same, of course, but I believe he decides, each year, to emphasize certain parts. He studies all year, planning and rehearsing the singing of it. Where? He has special quarters in a different section of the edifice. I've never seen him except at the time of the song. No, he stays apart. They turned again to the robe, examining each section to be certain that Kira had missed nothing. A tender brought tea and they sat together, talking of the robe and its stories, of the history it told, of the time before the ruin. Jameson closed his eyes again and recited, Ravaged all, Bogo Tabal, Timore Toron, Tutu now gone. Kira recognized the lines, some of her favorites, though she didn't understand them. As a tyke, the rhyming sounds had charmed her out of the boredom that she often felt during the interminable song. Bogo Tabal, Timore Toron, she had chanted to herself at times. What does it mean, that section? She asked Jameson now. I believe it tells the names of lost places, he explained. I wonder what those places looked like. Timore Toron. I like the sounds. That's part of your job, Jameson reminded her. You use the threads to remind us of how they looked. Kira nodded and smoothed the robe again, finding the tragic toppling cities and the interspersed meadows of soft greens. Jameson set his teacup on the table, went to the window, and looked down. The workers are finished. After the gathering and this year's song, you'll be able to start dyeing new threads for the robe. She looked up, dismayed, hoping to see by his expression that he was making a small joke, but his look was solemn. Kira had thought that when this work was complete, she could turn to her own projects, to some of the elaborate patterns that she could feel and see in her mind. Sometimes her fingers quivered with the desire to make those scenes. Will the robe become so damaged during the song that it will need repairing again? She asked him, trying not to show how distressing the thought was to her. She wanted to please him. He had been her protector, but she didn't want to keep doing this forever. Oh, no. His voice was reassuring. Your mother kept up with the small repairs each year, and now you've very capably redone the places that needed restoration. After this year's song, there will probably be only a few scattered broken threads for you to fix. Then Kira was puzzled. Jameson reached toward the robe and gestured at the empty, unadorned expanse across the shoulders. Here lies the future, he said, and now you will tell it to us, with your fingers and your threads, he told her. His eyes had a piercing, excited look. She tried to conceal her shock. So soon? She murmured. He had referred to this enormous task before, but she thought that when she was older, when she had more skill, more knowledge. We have waited a long time for you, he said, and looked at her firmly, as if he dared her to refuse. How's everybody doing so far? Chapter 19. It began early. At dawn, Kira could hear the sounds, even from her room on the opposite side of the building, as the people started to gather. Quickly she finished dressing, pulled the brush through her hair, and ran to Thomas's room on the other side of the corridor. From there, they could look down at the plaza where all large gatherings took place. Unlike the day of the hunt, This crowd was subdued. Even small tykes, usually so unruly, clung to their mother's hands and waited quietly. The sound that had awakened Kira was not shouts and jostling, but simply the tread of feet as the people streamed up the narrow lanes and moved into the throng waiting to enter the building. From the fen path came a steady flow of silent citizens, clutching and leading their tykes. From the opposite direction, from the area where Kira and her mother had lived, came others whom she recognized from her old neighborhood. There was her mother's widowed brother with his boy, Dan, but the small girl, Mar, was not with him. Perhaps she had been given away. On a typical day, families were scattered and apart, tykes scrambling unsupervised, parents at work, but today hubbies stood with their wives and tykes with their families. The people seemed solemn and expectant. "Where's the staff?" Kira asked, looking around Thomas's room. "They took it yesterday." Kira nodded. They had come and taken the robe yesterday as well. Weary though she was of the work, her room seemed diminished with it gone. "Should we go down?" she asked him, though she didn't relish the prospect of joining the crowd. "No, they said they'd come for us. I asked the tender who brought my breakfast." "Look!" Thomas pointed. "Over there, way in the back. See, by the tree just before the weaving shed? Isn't that Matt's mother?" Kira followed his pointing finger with her eyes and found the same gaunt woman who had eyed them suspiciously from the squalor of the cot. Today she was washed and tidy. Beside her, holding her hand, was the tyke who looked so much like Matt. The two stood waiting as a family, but there was no second child, no Matt. A wave of sorrow swept through Kira, a feeling of loss. Looking down at the sea of faces, Kira gradually recognized people here and there. The weaving women, separate from each other, each with a hubby and children. The butcher, clean for a change, with his large wife and 2 tall sons. The entire village had gathered now, only a few stragglers still hurrying up the lanes. A small surge of movement began, and she could see that the people were shuffling forward. The crowd rippled like water moving on the river bank when a log floated by. "The doors must have opened," Thomas said, leaning forward to see. They watched as the entire village, person by person, entered the building. Finally, when the crowd outside was almost entirely gone, and now they could hear the murmur of voices and the shuffling of footsteps from below inside the building, a tender appeared in Thomas's doorway and beckoned. "It's time," the tender said. Except for a quick peek through a cracked open door when she looked for Jameson one afternoon, Kira had not seen inside the Council of Guardians Hall since the day of her trial months before. The circumstances had been so different then, when she entered the cavernous room and limped alone down its central aisle, hungry, lonely, and fearful for her life. Today she still leaned, as she had that day, on her stick, but now she was clean, healthy, and unafraid. Today she and Thomas were brought through a side entrance near the front, so that they saw the faces of the village watching them. The tender pointed, directing them to a row of 3 wooden chairs on the left, just below the stage, facing the audience. Kira could see that there was another, longer row of chairs on the opposite side, and she recognized the Council of Guardians members, who were already seated there. Jameson was among them. Quickly, reminding herself of the custom, she bowed her head toward the worship object on the stage. Then she followed Thomas, and together they took their places in 2 of the chairs. A murmur passed through the audience, and Kira felt her face flush in embarrassment. She didn't like being singled out. She didn't want to sit here at the front. She remembered the derisive voice of one of the weavers only a few days before. "She don't need us no more," the woman had called. "It's not true. I need all of you. We need each other." Gazing at the crowded audience, Kira remembered the many past years when she had come dutifully with her mother to the gathering. Always they sat in the back where she couldn't see or hear, and she had endured the event bored and restless, sometimes kneeling on her seat to try to peer around the spectators' shoulders and get a glimpse of the singer. Her mother, she remembered, had always been attentive and had gently restrained her when she wriggled in the seat. But the gathering and the song were long and difficult for tykes. The people in the crowded audience, who though respectful had been shifting in their seats and whispering, quieted completely when Kira and Thomas entered and took their places. Everyone waited. Finally, in the silence, the four-syllable chief guardian, whom Kira had not seen since the trial and whose name she still could not recall, was it Bartholomew, perhaps, rose from his seat on the other side. He walked to the space at the front of the stage and began the ritual that always opened the ceremony. "The gathering begins," he announced. "We worship the object," he said, gesturing toward the stage and bowing. The entire audience bowed respectfully toward the little crossed construction of wood. "I present the Council of Guardians," he said next, and nodded to the row of men, which included Jameson. As a group, they stood. For a nervous moment, Kira couldn't remember if the spectators were supposed to applaud, but a hush had fallen and the crowd was silent, though some heads seemed to nod toward the Council of Guardians in respect. "For the first time, I present the Carver of the Future," he gestured toward Thomas, who looked uncertain. "Stand," Kira whispered under her breath, knowing intuitively that it was the proper thing to do. Thomas stood awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other. Again, heads nodded in respect. He sat back down. She knew that she would be next, and she reached for her stick, which was leaning against the chair. "For the first time, I present the Robe Threader, the designer of the future." Kira stood as straight as she could and acknowledged the nods in her direction. She sat again. "For the first time, I present the singer of the future. One day she will wear the robe." The eyes of the villagers all turned to the side door, which had opened. Kira could see two tenders push Joe forward, pointing to the unoccupied chair. The tyke, dressed in a new but simple and unadorned gown, looked confused and uncertain, but her eyes found Kira's, and Kira beckoned to her, smiling. Joe grinned and hurried forward toward the chair. "Don't sit yet," Kira whispered. "Stand and look at the people. Be proud." With a shy grin, with one foot nervously rubbing the ankle of the other leg, the singer of the future stood and faced the crowd. Her smile, hesitant at first, quickly became both self-confident and infectious. Kira could see the people smile back. "Now you can sit," Kira whispered. "Wait," Joe whispered back. She raised one hand and waggled her fingers at the audience. A ripple of gentle laughter ran through the large crowd. Then Joe turned and hoisted her small self, knees first, onto the chair. "I be giving them a little wavy," she confided to Kira. "Finally, I present our singer, who wears the robe," the chief guardian announced, when the people had quieted. The singer, wearing the magnificent robe and holding the carved staff in his right hand, entered from the other side. The crowd gasped collectively. Of course they saw him, and the robe, each year, but this year was different because of the work that Kira had done on the ancient embroidery. As the singer moved toward the stage, the folds of the robe glistened in the torchlight. The colors of the threaded scenes glowed in their subtlety. Golds, light yellows deepening to vibrant orange, reds from the palest pink to the darkest crimson, greens, all shades, threaded in their intricate patterns, told the history of the world and its ruin. As he turned to mount the few stairs to the stage, Kira could see the broad blank expanse across the singer's back and shoulders, the blank that she had been picked to fill, the future that she had been chosen to create. "What's that noise?" Thomas murmured. Kira had been distracted by her awareness and an appreciation of the robe and all that it meant. But now she heard it too, a dull, intermittent, metallic noise, a muted clank. Now it was gone. There, she heard it again, a scraping clank. "I don't know," she whispered back. The singer turned, at the center of the stage, after bowing slightly to the worship object, and now faced the audience. He fingered the staff like a talisman, but did not need its guidance yet. His face was impassive, expressionless. Then he closed his eyes and began to breathe deeply. The mysterious sound had disappeared. Kira listened carefully, but the muted scrape had subsided. Looking at Thomas, she shrugged and settled back to listen. She glanced at Joe and could see that the tyke's eyes were closed too, and she was forming the first words silently with her mouth. The singer held up one arm, and Kira, from her knowledge of the robe, knew that he was displaying the sleeve with the scene of the world's origin, the separation of land and sea, the emergence of fish and birds, all of it in the tiniest stitches around the border of the left sleeve, aloft now with his arm outstretched. She could feel the awed admiration of the audience as they saw the robe displayed for the first time in a year. She felt pride in the work she had done. He started in a strong, rich baritone voice. No melody yet. Really. The song began with a chant. Gradually, melodies would enter, Kira recalled, some slow, soaring lyrical phrases, followed by other harsher phrases with a quick, pulsating beat. But it emerged slowly, as the world had. The song began with the origin of the world, so many centuries before. In the beginning. And since we had a late start, I'm going to be reading one more chapter, so don't panic. Don't fall. Chapter 20. Thomas nudged her and gestured with his head. Kira glanced over and smiled to see Joe, so eager and squirming earlier, now sound asleep in the big chair. It was late morning and the song had continued for several hours. Probably many of the tykes in the large hall were dozing, as Joe was. Kira was surprised not to be bored and drowsy herself. Before her, the song was also a journey through the patterned folds, and as the singer sang, holding up the related parts, she remembered each scene and the days of work, the search through Annabella's threads for exactly the right shades. Though she remained attentive, occasionally her mind wandered to her own task that loomed ahead. Now that the old dyer's threads were almost gone, and the woman herself was gone too, Kira found herself desperately hoping that she would be able to remember and to create the dyes alone. Thomas drilled her again and again from his written pages. Though Kira had told no one, not even Thomas, that she had realized recently to her surprise that she could read many of the words. Watching his finger on the page one day, she had noticed that goldenrod and greenwood began the same way, with a looping downward curve, and they ended the same way too, with a little twig-like upright line. It was like a game, to find the marks that made the sounds. A forbidden game, to be sure, but Kira found herself puzzling over it often when Thomas wasn't watching, and the puzzles had begun to explain themselves to her. The singer was in a quiet section now, one of those times following a great world disaster in which ice, white and gray sheets of it, made with small stitches so that it had no texture but instead an eerie, glistening smoothness, had engulfed the villages. Kira saw ice very seldom, only occasionally in the very coldest months when sleet struck the village, breaking tree branches, and the river froze near its banks. But she'd remembered the fearsomeness and destruction of it when she worked on that section, and had felt glad when beyond the edges of the ice disaster, green seeped in again, and a quiet, fruitful time ensued. He slid into the singing of the green part now, melodic and soothing, a relief after the frigid destruction that had made his voice harsh and forbidding. Thomas leaned over and nudged her again. She glanced at Joe, but the tyke had not moved. "Look down the aisle on the right," Thomas whispered. She did, and saw nothing. "Keep watching," Thomas murmured. The singer's voice continued. Kira watched the side aisle. Suddenly she saw it. Something moving stealthily, slowly, stopping now and waiting, then creeping forward again. People's heads blocked her view. Kira leaned slightly to the right, trying to see around them, trying not to let the Council of Guardians know that something disruptive was happening. She glanced at them, but they were all attentive and focused on the singer. It moved again in the shadows, and she could see now that it was human, a small human, on all fours like a stalking beast. She could see, too, that people sitting on the edge of the aisle were beginning to notice, though they kept their eyes toward the stage. There was a very small stir, shoulders turning slightly, quick glances, expressions of surprise. The small human crept forward again, inching stealthily closer to the first row. As he approached, it was easier for Kira to watch without changing her position, since her chair faced the audience away from the stage. Finally, as the intruder reached the edge of the first row, he stopped creeping, squatted, and looked forward toward the stage, toward Kira, Joe, and Thomas, with a grin. Kira's heart leapt. Matt! She didn't dare to speak aloud, but she mouthed the words silently. He wiggled his fingers in a wave. The singer inched his fingers up the staff, feeling for the place, and continued. Matt grinned and opened one hand to show her something, but the light was dim. Kira didn't recognize what he held. He held it up between his thumb and finger, displaying it to her importantly. She shook her head slightly, indicating that she couldn't tell what it was. Then, feeling guilty at her lapse in attention, she turned and began to watch the stage and the singer again. Soon she knew there would be an intermission, a break for lunch. She would figure out a way to catch up with the tyke then and examine and admire whatever he had brought. Kira listened to the singer's voice as he sang the serene melody of plentiful harvests and celebratory feasting. This part of the song coincided with her own feelings at the moment. She experienced an enormous sense of relief and joy now that Matt had returned and was safe. When she looked back, he had crept away again, and the aisle was empty. May the little singer have lunch with Thomas and me? It was the midday interruption of the gathering, a lengthy gap in the day for food and rest. The tender pondered Kira's question and agreed. Leaving by the side door through which they had entered, Kira and Thomas, accompanied by Joe, yawning, went up the stairs to Kira's room and waited for their food to be brought. On the plaza outside, the people would be eating the food they had brought with them and discussing the song. They would be anticipating the next section, a time of warfare, conflict, and death. Kira remembered it, the bright spatters of blood and crimson threads, but she put it out of her mind now. While Thomas and Joe began on the large lunch that appeared on a tray, she hurried across the hall to Thomas's room to look down from the window and scan the crowd for a dirty-faced tyke and a bent-tailed dog. But there was no need to search from the window. They were waiting for her in Thomas's room. "Matt!" Kira cried. She set her stick aside, sat on the bed, and took him into her arms. Branch danced at her feet, his eager nose and tongue damp on her ankles. "I've been on a horrid long journey," Matt told her proudly. She sniffed and smiled. "And you never washed, not once, while you were gone." "There'd be no time for washing," he scoffed. "I brung you a gifty," he told her eagerly, his eyes dancing with excitement. What was it that you held up at the gathering? I couldn't see it." "I brung you two things, a big and a little. The big be coming still, but I got the little here in my pocket." He dug one hand deep into his pocket and pulled out a handful of nuts and a dead grasshopper. "Nope, be the other side." Matt put the grasshopper on the floor for Branch, who grabbed it with his teeth and consumed it with a crunch that made Kira cringe. The nuts rolled under the bed. Matt plunged his hand into the opposite pocket and brought out something triumphantly. "Here you be." He handed the thing to her. She took the folded thing curiously and plucked the dead leaf, pieces, and dirt away. Then, while Matt watched with delight and pride suffusing his face, she unfolded it and held it to the window light. A square of filthy, wrinkled cloth. Nothing more. And yet it was everything. "Matt," Kira said, her voice hushed in awe, "you found blue." He beamed. "It were there, where she said." "Where who said?" "She, the old woman who makened the colors." She said there be blue yonder. He wiggled in excitement. Annabella? Yes, I remember. She did say that. Kira smoothed the cloth on the table, examining it. The deep blue was rich and even, the color of sky, of peace. But how did you know where, Matt? How did you know where to go? He shrugged, grinning. I recollect she pointed. I just followed where her point went. There be a path, but it's horrid far. And dangerous, Matt. Whoops. There we go. It's through the woods. There be not fearful in the woods. There be no beasts, Annabella had said. Me and Branchy, we walk for days and days. Branch, he ate bugs. And me, I had some food I took in from your mother. He nodded with a guilty look, but it weren't enough. After it be all gone, I ate nuts, mostly. I could have ate bugs if I had to, he added, boasting. Kira half listened to his tale as she continued to smooth the cloth in her hand. She had yearned so for blue. Now here it was, in her grasp. Then when I got to the place, them people, they give me food. They got lots, but not a bath, Kira teased. Matt scratched his dirty knee with dignity and ignored her. They was horrid surprised to see me come, but they give me plenty of food. Branchy, too. They liked Branchy. Kira looked down at the dog, asleep now at her feet, and nudged him affectionately with the tip of her sandal. Of course they did. Everybody loves Branch. But, Matt, what? Who are they, the people who have blue? He lifted his thin shoulders and wrinkled his forehead in an expression of ignorance. Dunno, he said. Them be all broken, them people. But there be plenty of food, and it's quiet-like and nice. What do you mean, broken? He gestured toward her twisted leg. Like you. Some don't walk good. Some be broken in other ways. Not all, but lots. Do you think it making them quiet and nice to be broken? Puzzled by his description, Kira didn't answer. Pain makes you strong, her mother had told her. She had not said quiet or nice. Anyways, Matt went on, them got blue for certain sure. For certain sure, Kira repeated. I suppose you like me best now, I? He grinned at her, and she laughed and said she liked him best of all. Matt pulled away from her and went to the window. On tiptoe, he peered down and then out. The crowds were still there, but he seemed to be looking beyond them for something. He frowned. You like the blue? He asked her. Matt, she said passionately, I love the blue. Thank you. It be the small gifty, but the big one be coming soon, he told her. He continued watching through the window. Not yet, though. He turned to her. Got food? He asked. If and I wash? They left Matt and Branch in Thomas's room when they were summoned back to the afternoon section of the gathering. This time they were ushered in and took their seats with less formality. There was no need for the chief guardian to introduce them to the villagers. But the singer, looking refreshed after lunch and a rest, made a ceremonial entrance again. He held his staff as he stood at the foot of the stage, and the audience applauded him in acknowledgement of his remarkable performance in the morning. His expression didn't change. It had not changed all day. No proud smile. He simply stood gazing with intensity at the populace, the people for whom the song was an entire history, the story of their upheavals, failures, and mistakes, as well as the telling of new tries and hopes. Kira and Thomas applauded as well, and Jo, watching and imitating them, clapped her hands enthusiastically. Through the noise of the applause, as the singer turned and mounted the stairs to the stage, Kira glanced at Thomas. He had heard it too. The dull, dragging sound of metal. The same sound they had noticed in the morning before the song began. Kira looked around, puzzled. No one else seemed to notice the abrupt, heavy noise. The villagers were watching the singer as he breathed deeply in preparation. He moved to the center of the stage, closed his eyes, and fingered the staff, looking for the place. He swayed slightly. There! She had heard it again. Then, almost by accident, just for a second, she glimpsed it. Suddenly, Kira realized with horror what the sound was. But now there was only silence, and then the start of the song. Yes, we're going to leave on that cliffhanger for right now. But for anybody who has actually read this book so far, you know what Kira just saw. And I haven't read forward in the book, but I remember what Kira saw. Things are about to get really real in the next few chapters, guys. Things are about to get super duper real. But, as always, thank you all so very much for joining me for this book reading this evening. I have greatly enjoyed it, as always. Sorry about all the false starts. I had like 3 false starts today. I'm still trying to figure out what the whole age restriction thing was about. I just don't know. But hopefully we don't have those issues next week. But until then, I will see you guys Monday, normal time, 8 p.m., Eastern Standard Time. But until then, stay hydrated, stay safe, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.